Hello and welcome once again to Santa Cruz's #1 PowerPoint live stream. Today, discussing a subject near and dear to all of our hearts, those of us who have bodies and faces, and that subject is physiognomy. Now, you may have heard it said that a hairy belly indicates talkativeness, and you may also have heard it said that this is inferred from birds, for the signal bodily trait of birds is a hairy belly, while their most distinctive turn of mind is their talkativeness. So this is something that we've all heard said, maybe about us, maybe we've even said it about somebody else, but I think that we don't very often think about where this expression comes from. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to be talking about physiognomy, which is where this very common expression about the hairy-bellied bird originally comes from. So, there is this problem for philosophers in ye old times, as of now, which is that, you really want to be able to figure out, hey, are people awful or not? You want to be able to figure out if somebody's good, if somebody's bad, if somebody should be a king or a subject, what's going on. Ideally, before you waste time talking to them, right? You don't want to get to know somebody just to find out that they're awful, just to find out that they're a jerko, just to find out that they are not naturally fitted to rule. So you feel like, well, if nature had really done what it was supposed to, if it had done a good job on people, they'd have little windows in their chests where you could see what their souls were like. They'd be visible people. You could see what was going on inside of them. You could know in advance whether they were going to be jerkos or not. The problem is, of course, that the inside stuff is not visible in actual fact. We are stars wrapped in skin, as people sometimes say. We are freshly wrapped in skin. It keeps all of our terrible smells inside of us, as opposed to outside, hides our nasty guts, and also prevents people from seeing our souls. So this is a major flaw of nature, as Aristotle, as Lucian, as Juvenal, as a lot of ancient thinkers, poets, etc. will remark. How do you work around this? Well, that is where physiognomy comes in. Now, to say what physiognomy is, I'm going to start with a story. A story that gets kind of recirculated a lot. It shows up in Nietzsche. It shows up in a few other modern sources. It originally comes from a dialogue, a Socratic dialogue by Phaedo. Yes, Plato fans, you heard me right. The dialogue is by Phaedo, the character from Plato's dialogue. Phaedo, who was also a real person, who apparently wrote Socratic dialogues of his own. And this one is called the Zopyrus. And it starts out, apparently, the dramatic setup is as follows. Well, Zopyrus, who is a dude who claims to be able to infer anybody's true nature just by looking at their body, accused Socrates of having all manner of serious vices in front of a big crowd of Socrates' friends. And they're all like, well, you're crazy, Zopyrus. We know Socrates. He's the most virtuous guy in town. And Socrates says, hey, ease up on this guy a little bit. He's actually right. I do have all of these vices inborn in my nature, but I have kicked them all to the curb using reason. That's the power of philosophy. Well, what Zopyrus is doing, Zopyrus's professional affiliation is that he's a physiognomist and he's doing physiognomy. Physiognomy is the science of figuring out what people are like on the inside, in their souls, on the basis of what they look like outside, on the basis of their bodies. He does this to Socrates. Socrates says, yes, you're right, I'm actually like this, but the power of my soul has changed me, has improved me. So this is the science that has a long history, allegedly, in the ancient world. The story circulates about Pythagoras that when he was accepting teenagers as students, he'd really check them out and make sure that they looked like they had a good soul. So he'd do physiognomy on them. Like most stories about Pythagoras, this one's probably not true. But it does establish a very kind of long and deep history for the practice of physiognomy in ancient Greece. The people who invented this story about Pythagoras were attaching it to the same guy who invented mathematics, so they're trying to assign a kind of a scientific genealogy to it. It is a kind of a popular science in the ancient world. So we encounter it in all sorts of weird places, like the Noctes Atticae, like the Tusculan Disputations. It just shows up kind of all over the place. People discuss it casually, kind of almost as people talk about physics or what have you now, which is the science that everyone knows about. There are also a number of technical treatises that are written about this science. It shows up in kind of a scientific discourse at a number of points throughout history as well. There's Pythagoras, maybe, at the very beginning. It shows up a little bit in the Hippocratic Corpus, where we're perhaps less likely to recognize it as being obviously crazy, because indeed doctors do look at people to tell if they're sick. The Hippocratic Corpus tells you how to do this, but it also tells you how to judge people's physical and mental dispositions by looking at them. So that is a form of physiognomy. Shows up in bits and pieces throughout the Hippocratic Corpus, the earliest evidence for Greek medicine. Around 300 BCE, you start seeing it being treated a little bit more seriously. Aristotle refers to it in a couple of places as something that can possibly be real. There's a doctor who writes a whole treatise on it named Loxus, who's probably roughly contemporary with Aristotle. And then some of Aristotle's followers in the first generation after Aristotle's death write a whole treatise about physiognomy. And the bolded authors in this timeline are the ones who actually wrote books about it. They're not necessarily the authors we have. We don't have Loxus, that's gone. We reconstruct that from other later texts in the physiognomic tradition. Pseudo-Aristotle's text we do have. We have all of pseudo-Aristotle's physiognomy. Later on, around 100 CE, Galen talks a lot about it, and Polemon writes a very long book about physiognomy, which we do not have in the Greek anymore, but we have it in Arabic. We have the whole thing in Arabic. You'll notice that kind of there are bursts and spurts of scientific evidence in physiognomy. You got it in like the tail end of classical Athens, and you have it again in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE during a period that's known as the Second Sophistic, a period when rhetoricians, people who can give speeches about stuff, are basically kind of rock stars, going and touring all around the empire, just giving speeches about various things that are found and presented to them, like fish and blocks of rock and what have you. We'll talk a little bit about why physiognomy was so important for those people, why it's good to give speeches with later. But I do want to mention now a fun little thing about Polemon, which is that he is probably subtweeted in another interesting technical text from exactly this period, which is Artemidorus of Daldas's Oneirocriticon, dream reading text, book of interpretation of dream stuff, which is going to be the subject of a future episode of this stream. In that, Artemidorus is talking about, like, well, who do you trust if you see them in a dream, and who do you not trust? And he says, well, of course you trust a dream interpreter if you see a dream interpreter in a dream. But absolutely do not trust physiognomists if you see them in a dream. Now, people who have done some research on this, and they're pretty sure he was talking about Polemon because there was kind of a personal rivalry between these two, because they came from rival cities, because Polemon had vigorously trashed a fellow townsman of Artemidorus. So Polemon is involved in a kind of a war of words among writers of technical treatises about stuff during the Second Sophistic, a time when pretty much everything was decided by wars of words. And then in late antiquity, comes back into vogue again. You've got Adamantius, the sophist, who writes a treatise on this, and Anonymous Latinus, a Latin treatise on physiognomy. And all this feeds directly into medieval traditions. Physiognomy is a bit more mainstream, as it turns out, in the Islamic world than the West, but in both places it becomes an important part of medieval culture. One of those parts of ancient culture that's really just picked up directly in the Middle Ages. How does this work? How does physiognomy work? How do you make it a science? How do you make it not be just like looking at somebody and saying, oh, that person is obviously a criminal and a freak? How do you make it be a science? Well, what does it mean to be a science in antiquity? It means, among other things, that there is a method that sets up a correspondence between some kind of sign and some kind of interpretation. Sciences in antiquity are almost all about interpreting signs. When it comes to medicine, you're interpreting signs of illness. When it comes to astronomy, you're interpreting star signs as to what they mean for the future. When it comes to dream interpretation, you're reading the signs that come out of somebody's dreams. And when it comes to physiognomy, the way that you make it scientific is by breaking down the human body into a series of signs and giving a methodology for reading them. Now, what's on your screen right now is the preface to Pseudo-Aristotle's Physiognomy. This preface expresses ideas that remain very prevalent in the tradition right up through the Middle Ages. And there are a couple of points that Pseudo-Aristotle really emphasizes. He says, no critter has ever been born that has the appearance of one critter and the mind of some different critter, right? So you never get a lion that's born with the body of a lion but the mind of a deer. You never get a cowardly bull or whatever. Ferdinand the Cowardly Bull is an impossibility. But rather, the body and the soul of a critter always belong to the same species, so that it's necessary for a certain kind of mind to accompany a certain kind of body. But if this should be true, then it will be possible to physiognomize. The idea being that if a certain kind of mind always accompanies a certain kind of body among animals, and if people sometimes look like animals, then on the basis of that resemblance you can make inferences about the kinds of souls that people have. They have the souls of the animals that they resemble. So some people physiognomize on the basis of animal species, positing for each species a certain kind of appearance and a certain kind of mind. Some people do that by animal body part, as we'll see as well, not just by the whole body. Others also do this, but do not evaluate on the basis of animals exclusively, but also on the basis of types of humans, dividing them up according to ethnos, to tribe, to people, what have you, insofar as these differ in appearance and habits. For instance, Egyptians or Thracians or Scythians, and making a selection of significant traits on these grounds. The idea is then that you are like what you resemble, and what you resemble is something about which we already know something, we already know the mind, we know the mind of. So on the basis of resemblance, we can make inferences about what you are like. So for instance, recalling the hairy-chested bird that we were talking about earlier, right? Perfect example. Birds have hairy chests, bodily trait. Birds are talkative, trait of mind. So where you see a hairy belly, you can infer from that that talkativeness is present also. Therefore, people who, like birds, have hairy bellies are also talkative. They are garrulous. It's an inference from resemblance to an animal. I've encountered this in my own life. I have these horrible coward's calves, not pictured here, but they sort of look like the ones on your screen to the left. And they are anaspasmenoi, drawn upwards, rather than kataspasmenoi, drawn downwards. The physiognomic treatises all agree that these are coward's calves, because they resemble the legs of the cowardly deer. And indeed, my legs are almost exclusively used for running from things, for fleeing, as opposed to standing in place, as presumably they would be if the calves were kataspasmenoi, drawn downwards instead of drawn upwards. There are other examples, and I really hope I will not hear from the rock about this, because I want to make it clear I don't actually believe in physiognomy, but Polemon says that you can judge if somebody's neck is roughly the size of their head, then they have that trait in common with the chicken, which also has a neck roughly the size of its head. So that means that somebody whose neck is roughly the size of their head is going to be greedy and stupid and violent like the chicken. Again, I don't think that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson actually has any of these characteristics. I think he's a very generous man, a gentleman and a scholar. Please don't track me down and beat me up, Mr. "The Rock" Johnson. And there are other examples like this. Mice, for instance, are hypocritical and forgetful, so if you see somebody with beady little eyes and mouse ears and whiskers like Mickey Mouse, say, you can know that he too is a hypocrite who is given to forgetting. So pretty much the entire animal kingdom gets read in this way. You can use the resemblance of people to any old animal to judge what is up with them, to figure out what is hiding in the secret box of their soul. Now, the other thing that was mentioned in the preface that I quoted before is this practice of physiognomy by ethnic resemblance. The idea that various peoples have characteristics of the soul which are uniform among all of them, and so if you resemble somebody from somewhere else, an inference can also be drawn about your soul. Now, this goes about as well as you would expect. A lot of just kind of vicious racist judgments drawn about various ethnicities throughout the ancient worlds. It is often said by scholars of the subject that there is no such thing as ancient racism, which is sort of true. It is sort of true because people don't really have a concept of biological race in antiquity, number one. And number two, there's no legislative structure producing racism. But there are racist tendencies in antique thought, and one of the places where they really crop up is in the assumptions underlying physiognomy. For instance, is in this passage, which shows up in Anonymous Latinus, the late antique Latin physiognomy, saying that curly hair reveals a person who is deceitful, timid, greedy, and profit-seeking. And these inferences stem from comparison to Egyptians who are timid and to Syrians who are greedy. So there's a kind of, say, anti-black, but anti-brown, just more generally racism, involved in these physiognomic tracks. The traits of people from Africa and from India tend to be read negatively as a rule. Although people from those areas are credited with cleverness, the physiognomic tracks regard them as cowardly and deceitful. This is not exactly the same thing as modern biological racism, either in its form or in its content, and nothing shows that more clearly than the parallel treatment of Those nasty old Germans with their horrible blonde hair, which signifies a character that cannot be taught and cannot be governed. Just the character of an idiot who will never learn anything on the basis of comparison with people's actual experiences of the German. So the racism here is centered around treats as a norm, basically Greeks and Italian Romans. And anyone who diverges from that norm comes to embody various kinds of negative characteristics. That kind of thinking doesn't show up super often in ancient literary texts, but it does show up in Physiognomy and in a couple of other of these kind of technical type treatises. So those are the two main methods of physiognomic reading that are available in antiquity. The ethnic mode of interpretation practiced less frequently, as far as we can judge from these physiognomic treatises, less frequently than the animal interpretation, because there are a lot of animals in the world. There are just a whole bunch of them. And the multiplication of possible terms of comparisons is really an advantage for scientific texts, for physiognomical texts in particular, for a couple of reasons. One, it allows writers of treatises to write more stuff, which lets them fill space, which lets them demonstrate their own kind of extensive expertise in the topic of doing physiognomy. For another, in practice, you can basically say something about anyone, and moreover, you can say something positive and something negative about anyone. Say, like, somebody has coward's calves, but the face of a lion or something. Well, you leave the calves off out of account, and you just talk about their nice lion face. Unless, that is, you actually want to drag them, which is a lot of what ancient physiognomy appears to be used for. It is a repertoire of insults, which is why the vast majority of physiognomic readings are negative. If you look at a physiognomic treatise, you'll see like 5-6 negative characteristics for every one positive that you'll see. Physiognomical treatises tend to be, for the most part, repertoires of abuse. And that makes sense, right? Maybe in the context of the Second Sophistic especially, or the world of rhetoric at the end of classical Athens. These periods when rhetoric really matters, when the way that you talk about people can have a serious impact on their career, can also boost your career if you do a good job of it. Polemon's own treatise on physiognomy shows some evidence of how this would work. He devotes a lot of the treatise, well, not a lot, but like a couple of pages, to just completely trashing his a rival rhetorician of his, Favorinus of Arles, accusing him of having only one or possibly no testicles, and explaining how having no testicles makes him resemble various like distasteful kinds of animals that there are, and also how his eyeballs totally suck and are the eyeballs of a scoundrel. Now that kind of insult is not particularly, let's say, valuable or powerful as such, but when you can cloak it in a vocabulary of physiognomy and when you can cloak it in a physiognomic method, then suddenly it's a science diss. And that science diss makes it appear to have a greater degree of authority than just the insult on its own would have. Polemon can make those insults stick to Favorinus, and his attack on Favorinus does seem to have been connected to Favorinus's exile, although it's hard to say that any particular insult did the trick. Polemon can make those insults stick because they come out of a science, because they are nerd disses. They're not just things that he was making up to say to make Favorinus cry. Well, I've been talking about this kind of a scientific discourse of physiognomy. It follows and influences popular belief, especially in late antiquity and the Middle Ages. Even influences popular culture in the European Middle Ages. And it raises the question for us, for me at least, of what you see when you see somebody else's face, when you see a stranger's face. We, just see the face of another human being. We see a face that's somehow opaque to us, that's difficult to read. A face that poses a mystery which we would overcome, supposing we wanted to, by getting to know the stranger in question. This is different, I think, than what ancient people saw when they saw a stranger's face. What they saw was a face that resembled something, a face that belonged to a network of resemblances, and that could be read on that basis. You don't need to get to know a stranger to know what a stranger is like, if you can just look at them and see into their soul using the techniques of physiognomy. Now, there's an everyday physiognomy, recognizing that somebody looks like a lion or what have you, and there's a highly technical physiognomy that reads the various flecks and blood vessels in a person's eyes as signs of their personality. But those are different in degree of complexity rather than in kind. Physiognomy is a kind of a gaze. It's a way of looking at the other, seeing not a strange person, but rather a familiar critter. Speaking of familiar critters, let's see if the cat wants to earn her keep this week. Hey cat, will you do something cute for the stream? Okay, well, she's not really having it, but that's a wrap. Everybody have a good night.